With that, allow me a few words about the motivation for today's event. The ALLEA working group Science and Ethics that I alluded to already has a focus on activities that can help foster research integrity in the scholarly endeavor. Most importantly, and most recently also, it was, for example, tasked by the European Commission in 2017 to revise the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity. And broadly speaking, in its approach and in its work, the working group Science and Ethics addresses all dimensions that impinge on research integrity, from the level of the individual scholar to framework conditions that are in place at higher education institutions, the employers, in other words, across to systemic factors such as H index, journal impact factor, but also university rankings. Because quite some work is already done on those different elements that I just itemized a second ago, we decided and we chose to take a broader perspective with today's webinar and looking at it from a slightly bigger, to take a bigger perspective of that whole issue of assessing research, of metrics questions. And we particularly decided that we would like to look at it from by asking ourselves two specific questions, which we consider absolutely elementary and fundamental to this whole exercise. And the first one is really, why do we actually evaluate the output of publicly funded research? It seems evident these days that it's done, but very seldom people actually ask themselves, why do we do that? And related to that is the second question, how can we make the evaluation match the purpose of why we're actually assessing this or that kind of research output? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And thank you. To address these two questions that I just raised, we have invited 4 esteemed colleagues. And we start and begin with a presentation by Ellen Hazelkorn, who you see on the left on the slide, in a lovely Irish accent, if I dare say so. And I'm very delighted that she agreed to speak to us today and share with us her expertise and insights from over 2 decades of work on the impact of international policy developments on higher education systems. She has done fundamental work on the Irish situation, the European context, but also the global situation. And this is a very, very brief summary of her outstanding curriculum. So, Ellen, thank you sincerely for accepting our invitation, and the floor, if I may say so, is yours now.
Young Academy for inviting me to this. So I'm really putting forward what I would call a provocation, as opposed to talking about some of the details, but the questions that Roger poses are certainly very key ones. So I thought I would focus around this on the role of science and in its widest sense, and what I call the accountability agenda in terms of where we're sitting now. And I have a couple of comments to make throughout it, but I'm reminded of the importance of some of these issues by an article that was in the New York Times yesterday by a man called Ashish Jha, who is now, I follow him regularly because I'm a regular CNN watcher, I should say. And I'm interested, Roger's talked about my Irish accent. I'm from the States, so I'm very interested in what has been going on. And there was, this man was at Harvard. He's now the dean of the medical school at Brown, but School of Public Health. But the point of his article was to detail yet a hearing in the US Senate the other day in the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, discussing not the developments that we're hearing about the pandemic and moving forward. Oh no, they were discussing hydrochloric hydrochloroquine and its valuable contribution to COVID, based on the idea that they thought it sounded like a good idea. And as he says, what's happened to science? And so this is part of the kinds of background as to some of these kinds of issues that I wanted to talk about. So if you might move that forward. So I wanted to just set this up as a bit of a provocation and then put it in this wider context. So one of the kinds of things that's quite interesting is that we have an enormously growing participation in higher education around the world. The numbers of students is set to grow. We're looking currently at 220 million, and it's likely to grow upwards of 260 and so on million by 2030. And we now have about 20,000 universities, according to the International Association of Universities. Obviously, the terminology of university is often very much government determined. But as the world, as we know, has become more complex and interconnected, there is greater reliance on science and the economy on knowledge production and new ideas. But as science society, and we have more people participating, and as knowledge is more important, society is becoming more demanding. More people are our graduates, the world is asking more questions, and increasingly there is actually an increasing focus on the distribution of the benefits of it. We've seen that in terms of the debate around globalization, but we've also seen this in the sense of growing inequity, undermining trust, divisions and disparities between urban and rural areas and between sections of the population. And knowledge, is just as the example I have just given, is both informative or authoritative, but it's increasingly partisan. The responses we've seen to the public health guidelines, whether they're in the US, which I've looked at, or also obviously across Europe, and elsewhere, are increasingly partisan. So we've highlighted the increasing amount of international collaborations, this kind of a mechanism we're having this event itself, renewed interest in science and experts, but also a worrying trend in the rising influence of hoaxes, QAnon, which is a big influence growing everywhere. And indeed, 2 people elected to the US Congress are supporters and spokespeople on behalf of QAnon. QAnon, basically a hoax theory in support of Donald Trump. And we've seen quite a lot of stuff going on around vaccine nationalism and borders and so on. So next slide. And I often say researchers are not innocent victims. Academic culture is part and parcel of the increasing attention. At the same time as we have more and more people involved in higher education and participating, we also have this increasing focus on elite models of universities, increasing focus on world-classness, this focus that rankings has given us on the top few institutions, indeed the top institutions, the top 100 in the Shanghai rankings constitute less than 2% of global students. So putting that into a context. And what I would call self-reflective modes of accountability, that we review stuff within ourselves in our own little communities. And so we've seen this issues around concentrating excellence versus issues around expanding or enhancing human capital or skills, the issues around regional capacity. We've seen increasing differentiation between teaching and research missions versus greater integration across teaching and research. And we've seen this rewarding of traditional outcomes, which still remain the key part of academic recruitment and promotion, rather than valuing civic and social responsibility. So higher education, my last point in the provocation, sits at this crossroads within the public policy domain. Its roles and responsibilities have become increasingly more important over the years, and this has implications for all institutions, all researchers, and indeed much wider afield into issues around systems and how we look at higher education systems. So moving on. So one of the big issues, it seems to me, is around this issue of the social contract and public goods. There has been, for quite many decades, a kind of an unwritten issue that as public institutions are funding, the issue of accountability comes to the fore. And that has been an unwritten issue around the social contract. But as we've seen this evolution from elite to mass institutions, which is really where we're at, we're talking 50, 60% of our population in higher education, this has been transformative. But at the same time that higher education has expanded, ironically, it's become more unequal. We have at this point in time, as the OECD has said, we have income inequality is at its highest level ever. And we see most of the effects of this within countries as less between countries because, interestingly, the effects of globalization, but within countries. And we see increasingly a stratification of access to public goods and life chances according to whether socioeconomic, social class, in traditional way, race, ethnic factors, regional, urban, rural, and we see how that plays out both politically and in civil disorder. And we also see this issue of income inequality is affecting trust more than issues around economic growth. So at the time in which higher education is more and more dependent on public funding, more questions are being asked about its value, its impact, and indeed its benefit. So moving on. So there are what I refer to as three interrelated issues around this issue of public trust and so on. There's the issue of public attitudes towards public services, the issues not just of the quality of those services, but access. Who has access and how are those goods distributed? We're going to engage in quite a long discussion now, which is quite interesting, about the distribution of the vaccine. Who gets it? Who gets it first? And then the issues that underpin that around taxation and funding. There's a degree of public trust. This is trust between different sectors of society, but most renowned between people who elites and the mass, but also access between different sectors in this whole rise about too many experts that we had at one stage in the Brexit debate, and we now see much wider. And then the issue of public interest in the use of public resources and their contribution and so on. Right, moving on. Better move up a bit faster. So, as was said by the WHO, we're fighting an infodemic, not just an epidemic. So this issue around the scientific method, which we probably understand because it's about questioning ideas, how ideas change and so on. But we've also seen lots of confusion about changing in recommendations. A big issue taking place in the media is the use of masks. So you said they weren't, you said they are. This backwards and forwards, papers retracted. So science itself becomes questioned. This rise, as I mentioned, in hoaxes, disinformation, and we see this confluence between the anti-vax movement and the anti-science movement converging with elements of populism, and we see that across Europe, elsewhere. Tensions between science and the economy. We have that going on in my country, in Dublin as elsewhere, opening up the economy versus the scientists who want to close it down, and this kind of the politicalization or the politicization of science. Another interesting thing is the way we have lots of public advisory committees that are advising governments, but they're often dominated by the medical and the public health, quite rightly you could say, but the humanities and social science researchers and indeed other fields are left on the sidelines. So we're not embracing a wide range. And arguably, one of the other things we probably are likely to see out of this is this increasing emphasis on short-termism and impact rather than, to some extent, some blue sky. And that's a debate that certainly is likely to be forthcoming. So moving on. So here's a couple of slides. This is a really interesting group, the Edelman Trust Barometer. They come out annually, so it's quite an interesting thing to look at. And in this one, they're basically showing a clear distinction between what the informed public thinks about. So the informed public is people with higher levels of education and so on, or people who are informed, their support for basic institutions, NGOs, business, government, and the media. You see that on the top line. And quote, the mass population, who largely has very little trust in these basic institutions. Next. And I thought, right, here's one of these conflicts between, are we imposing or looking at public health guidelines for everyone, or what about personal liberty? So I had someone talk to me about this the other day on this same thing, where we have these two scientists talking. Here we've got the bees, where they're saying, here's the necktie, I strongly recommended him wearing, protection, but he kept talking about his rights. And this is, again, this kind of conflict that, and we definitely see this a lot in the US, but we see this elsewhere as well. We're getting, even in Dublin, we're getting some of these marches. And here is the same thing divided between Republicans and Democrats as to how their view about scientists and science has changed and how it is so partisan. The red lines being the Republicans, the blue being the Democrats. So moving on. And here is just another slide. This is from The Economist, of talking about which governments have been more likely to follow the advice of science. Interesting, but perhaps not surprisingly, New Zealand at the top. Then we have China, Argentina. Then we have a cluster of European countries. But at the bottom, we have the US, Brazil, not surprising, probably not surprising, Britain. But then we have Spain, France, Italy, and so on. So to what extent was science a big part and role did it play in policy making? So moving on. So some of these implications that we're looking at. So one of the things that we have seen over the past decades, and this is quite clear as a trend since the millennium really, is this fact that global science is increasingly more polar. It used to be dominated by the US, Europe, and Japan, and we're now seeing upwards of 40 more countries who are prominent players within global science. And this is as international collaboration is strengthening, and as we know, it's a key part of research assessment. We're also seeing this shift of doing science differently, this shift to greater public and social accountability by embedding impact and benefit from the outset, not as an afterthought that you think about and you write as a kind of, oh, yeah, right, I better say something about this on my application. The speed up to open science. This has certainly been a factor that we've seen and witnessed during the current pandemic, the opening up of publications, but we also see that being pushed by researchers. Is this the writing on the wall for paywalls? And what I would call the unjustified dominance of top journals. But before we get too hopeful, what we see is an absolute coalescing by the major publishing companies around big data. And that really is where the money is. These other things are just a mechanism of bringing in the money, but we see an absolute coalescing by Elsevier and Springer and so on. The issues around academic excellence and productivity, interesting developments in the Netherlands and Finland about how we're looking at citations and the use of citations and other mechanisms for how we're assessing academic appointments and productivity and what constitutes that concept of excellence. We've also seen a broader audience for science. So despite all this, what I said about rise of hoaxes and so on, there is actually a rising number of people looking at it, and it reveals this increasing importance of science literacy. So I chaired an EU expert group several years ago on science education. And one of the things there was not about looking at science in the classroom, but looking at science broadly, the issue of science literacy and the amount of stuff that we're talking about in our world that require a basic understanding of science, even talking about recycling, talking about health, talking about the environment. They're all with some underpinning and knowledge on that literacy. Does this present a challenge to rankings, which rely on old-fashioned, if I could say, quantitative measures of excellence? And where has that led us? And that's another question. And then clearly there are implications for regarding the management of the funding of research and also of higher education. So moving on. This is just a chart just showing the level of increasing international collaboration that we've tracked over the last 30 years or so, just looking at that, or 20 years, sorry, and looking at the rising amount of international co-authorship, which has really taken off and is really a key indicator of, quote, excellence, if we can use that term. Right, moving on. And this is quite an interesting map, really, of 101 countries that have published articles on COVID between January and May, clearly dominated by the US and China, which is interesting despite all the rhetoric that you get at high political levels. The level of collaboration is very high. But aside from that, you see across it the involvement of people, even small numbers of people from around the world, all contributing published articles in this area. It's all contributing and involved in research in this area. And this shows much more global science as we've been talking about. Okay, next. So here's what I want to say here is really the importance of universities and university-based research as sitting at the center of virtually every area of public policy. In fact, I'm not sure that there's any area that isn't linked in some way into the sustainability of universities and research, and vice versa, whether that includes issues around foreign direct investment or transport policy. We know, of course, the European Union's strategy around smart specialization and regional growth, but it's across all areas that higher education is a key factor in that complex world of policy making. And that then brings me to the next slide, to this notion of repositioning science through engagement and looking at the fact that once we realize and understand that research has value beyond the academy, there are implications for teaching, learning, and research. It's not just a research issue, it's also for teaching and learning. It's for our higher education systems and our institutions. It's for how we fund and sustain it. And it's about what's measured, how it's measured, and by whom. And increasingly, we're looking at the engagement agenda as a core part of it. There's notions around what I would call the civic university, holistic engagement, not something sitting on the sidelines. We've historically always referred to this notion of third mission. To me, this isn't third mission. This is core. It is what I call the horizontal linking teaching and research. And we look increasingly at boundary crossing organizations. So my definition is they're engaging in learning beyond the campus walls, discovery which is useful beyond the academic community, and service that directly benefits the public. And finally, next slide. So some concluding thoughts. There is, as I refer to in that New York Times piece, often this misconception that issues about some of these issues impede our freedoms in some way. There's a view I got back last week from talking to people that the issue of engagement or regional engagement was a threat to academic freedom. or that it's too instrumentalist, or that engagement is some form of neoliberalism and telling people what to do. In my view, it's nothing further from the truth. Public accountability and transparency is a vital part of democratizing knowledge, and it is part and parcel of that shift between an elite society to a mass society of people who contribute to it. That the scientific method that we talk about is equivalent to the notions of critical thinking that we say are essential learning outcomes and defined by Bologna. The lessons of history show us that the best responses to international challenges are through ongoing structured dialogue, multilateral organizations, and continued collaboration. And ultimately, as the world becomes more complex, we need actively engaged and well-informed citizens because we see what happens when people are left behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen, for this thoughtful and provocative presentation, at the same time sharing your long-time insights from your work and your experience you've done in higher education systems, and linking it up with the current situation also and how it plays out in the COVID-19 situation. I like that a great deal. Just to say before I continue, I'm told by the organizers that if you want to ask questions through the chat function, you need to scroll down a bit in the program that we're using, WebEx. Scroll down a bit and go down really to the bottom where you see everyone, and then enter there your chat message or your question, in other words. Coming back to the program, as indicated in the program, the input that Ellen just provided in her impulse presentation, as it was termed in the program, serves as provocation for a panel. And for this panel, we invited three colleagues who I'd like to briefly introduce to you now. To begin with, Kostas Glinos, he's seen in the middle of the slide. He has been in charge of different R&D portfolios at the European Commission since 2003. He's currently heading the unit of open science, which is one of the flagship initiatives, if I can call it that way, of the European Commission for the last few years already. After him, we will have Michael Hill, in his capacity as a steering committee member of DORA, which is the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, which I suppose all of you know. But he's also deputy head of strategy at the Swiss National Science Foundation. Last but not least, as the last panelist, we will have Martin Dominik. He's reader in physics and astronomy at St. Andrews University in Scotland, but his participation in the panel today is due to his long-standing engagement in the Global Young Academy and his participation in one particular report from the Global Young Academy, which dealt with open science and assessments. I'd thus like to ask all of you in turn, starting with Kostas, then with Michael and Martin, to in turn comment on Ellen's presentation in 5 to 6 minutes each.
Okay, thank you very much, Roger. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to this meeting. Thank you, Ellen, for a very lucid and presentation. I like very much that it took a very broad perspective, and that it put the trust between science and society at its center. To be honest, I didn't find it very provocative. Maybe what I think or what I say are provocative things as well, that's why. But I think really this is one of the key issues of our times, not for science, the science establishment, but for our societies as a whole, at the point where science starts really considered elitist science and scientists by a big majority of the population, especially if we live in a democracy, then this is really, it's like the danger bells are ringing very loud. And this is because rational thinking is the main civilizing factor that allowed us to progress from the Middle Ages. And science is nothing else for me than the institution of rational thinking. It institutionalizes, it puts its structure, it organizes rational thinking. So we need trust. I mean, to the extent that scientists and science are considered ivory towers outside of society, self-regulated, then it will be very difficult to obtain this trust. In the European Commission, we have an agenda for open science that it is quite broad. So it includes, it addresses both things like open access, open data, data management, and things like that. And at the same time, responsible research and innovation, to some extent science and overall, the overall relations between science and society. We are looking also at things like science reproducibility, which has a big impact in the trust that people put on science for obvious reasons. If you change your opinion every other day as a scientist on what is true or what's not, then this can be very detrimental to the trust that citizens will put on you. We had a recent a communication on the European research area, on a reform of the European research area. This was published on the 3rd of September, and some of these issues were put forward in that communication. In particular, the area where we think we have made little progress over the years, although many of us know what should be done, but it's very difficult to actually do it, is this issue that you also mentioned of research assessments. So how to change the method by which researchers, scientists, educators are assessed, and their proposals for funding are assessed, and the institutions, I mean, with the rankings that you mentioned, are assessed. So we need a far more ambitious initiative in Europe, at least, but hopefully also that will grow globally. A coalition, if you prefer, of the willing, that are willing to make concrete commitments. We have already some very advanced institutions or advanced countries in that respect, but it's time now to go faster. And a central element of this policy proposal or policy initiative should be that this elite model of knowledge, that it's held very dearly in the minds of many of our academics, is reformed to a model where it's an obligation, a responsibility by the scientists to work towards societally relevant, useful outcomes together with society. We're taking many initiatives in that respect, including for citizen science, for example, which is important for more and more citizens to get involved in carrying out research or education, or in we're taking initiatives in engaging citizens in co-creation of projects. So not in the actual doing of research, but deciding what the objectives of the research should be, or what the work program of research. So I think there is a lot there of food for thought in what you said, and at the end we will need to redefine the notion of excellence. You also said this for the next decades. I think my time is up, so I'll stop there.
Thank you. We continue with Michael then. Thank you very much for keeping to the time, Kostas.
Thank you very much to both speakers that went before me for really interesting inputs, and also, of course, to Martin and Roger. This is a very interesting panel, and I'm very excited to be here. Other than Kostas, I will take Ellen's talk as a provocation, and I will try to respond to it as such, although, of course, I do, in general, completely agree with what you said, simply because it's true. But she brought up 5 provocations, and I was thinking to myself, like, how would I maybe respond to them in an equally provocative manner, so to speak? And the first point she was saying was how the number of universities and students are growing, and how that is a challenge maybe to the system. And I'm, I guess, not sure that in itself is a problem. I'm sure everyone will agree with me on this. I'm just sort of, like I said, being provocative as well, because the researchers themselves are also consumers of science. They're probably one of the biggest consumers. So the system in itself is not just outputting all this massive amount of knowledge to society, but it's also consuming it at the same time. So I think actually that our society and the world can deal with a huge number of academics working, as long as the sort of the logistics are in place to have these products go their way. And right now, with the way that publications are valued and managed, that there is a problem there. We are producing too much low quality stuff, and it's sort of not really working in that respect. Second and third provocation for me comes down to a key question or differentiation. Science communication. So with regards to the second provocation, I've asked myself, does science have a problem? Does society have a problem with science, or is it more a problem with science communication? In Switzerland, we have this research barometer, which is also in many other countries in Europe, which shows that actually Swiss society is quite comfortable with research doing its thing. And I think that is true by far for most research, because frankly, most academic papers are just plain boring to most people in the world. So I think they don't have a problem with the largest amount of science. Where the problem is more the communication of science to society. And I feel like there is an issue there, that there might be a sort of a role to play for expertise in that space more. I'll come to that in a sec. And the second point is science is authoritative. And so that's with provocation number 3. And I, of course, completely agree. But I wonder whether that is, again, just true primarily for science communication, because in science, the authoritarianism and the partisanship is something that is cherished. It's not a problem. It's something that should live happily and comfortably in it. It's only when it's communicated wrongly as a sort of competitive authoritarianism and a competitive partisanship in a destructive kind of way where it becomes a problem. With regards to the fourth provocation, researchers are not innocent victims. Here I just absolutely agree. I think this is completely true. And this is, I think, a bit of a problem, is this victimization of academics and the academic group. And I think what we need to do is take back control from the private sector, and this is happening with the open access and open science movement. That's very, very important. But also, and this is maybe a little bit more controversial again, from senior scientists, because the problem is that you have PhDs and postdocs who are young academics, but they are actually, very, very smart grown-ups. But in the system, they're often treated almost like children that need to be governed by all these boards where only the most senior scientists get to sit in. So funding institutions, universities, societies, even journals, at the very, very top, you always find, or very often you'll find, a group of senior academics. And there's an underrepresentation of younger academics who kind of lead at that level. So why shouldn't university board, the actual executive and decision-making board of the university, be made up by a third or half by PhDs and postdocs? And with that, I also think the diversification of that power should go further. So why is academia just something that PhDs, postdocs, and professors do? Why not science communicators? Why shouldn't they have the equal role in the system that a very senior professor does? And why I think there's more space for more jobs. And then finally, point number 5, higher education models might higher education models and their role in society. I also completely agree, and I think what we need to do is really rethink what these higher education models actually do. What is a PhD? What does it mean today? Because there's a long tradition of these roles and functions, and they might not be up to date anymore. They might need rethinking. Now, I'm kind of trying to keep an eye on time. I think it's sort of running towards the end of my section, but that was sort of my 5 responses to those points. I also found interesting what Kostas was saying in regards to evaluation, coming from the Swiss National Science Foundation. For me, evaluation is also the focus specifically in what happens within academia, not just society, that Kostas was pointing towards. And I think it plays an important role because otherwise there is no real competition there. In the private sector, you've got money, which sort of, if you have the money, that's what you compete for. But in academia, you need some sort of control mechanism that creates competition, and therefore that's sort of its role there, but it needs to be improved in that regard. And I'll close there for now, but I'm looking forward to discussing this further. It's very exciting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. I hear a lot of agreement so far. Curious to hear what Martin Dominik has got to say, if there's any disagreement now, because he's sort of speaking as a scholar who's still in academia at the moment. Martin, the floor is yours.
So let me add to the provocation. Contract with society is a great keyword. We can only succeed as society if we work together. The clue is in the word itself. We fail to see the proper picture if we look at individuals in isolation. We need to consider both interactions and specific context. And this holds at every level and scale, from research group to global society. We also need to appreciate being different. Diversity is one of our greatest strengths, and not a competing goal to excellence, right to the contrary. Lots of people are quite good at something, but nobody is good at everything. The quality of teams hinges on the complementary skills and interaction between its members. Those who are quite similar and interchangeable don't make a good team. Our societal development also requires empowered actors. People need to learn to decide for themselves what is right or wrong. Yes, we need to talk about ethics. They have to assume responsibility and accept to live with the consequences. Unwillingness to do so, including in managerial roles, is a key problem we're facing. People who are just the followers of rules and incentives is not something we should aim for. Instead, we should build on their creativity and initiative. We should also think about what knowledge creation concretely means. We only create knowledge in the public scholarly record, which is part of shared human culture, through communication that enables others to build on it, not by self-celebration. This does, however, not mean that it needs to translate within a given time frame. Even if that process takes decades or longer, it is valuable. We are, however, inefficient in advancing the record when we celebrate the fact that something is published in a journal or cited, which by itself does not create any societal value, while failing to have our eyes on the content as well as the rigor and integrity of the process. Increased productivity can in practice mean that we merely produce more waste. And sometimes much money is thrown after such kind of productivity, as well as ill-conceived prestige, which must not be mistaken for value. It is somewhat sciencey to call for objectivity in assessing merit. But what measures are objective while still being meaningful? Citation counts and other metrics of uptake are not objective. They are ultimately based on human decisions. Should we entirely mistrust human judgment, or rather learn to make good judgments? I would want to argue that the recipe against favoritism is not objectivity, it's transparency. Again, ethical leadership is required. All too frequently, I hear the term traditional metrics. However, a tradition only gets established once something is passed on from generation to generation. The age index was invented only 15 years ago, and certain practices have become fashionable without ever becoming universal, and there's no such thing as tradition in research assessment. Thanks to Alan for using the term old-fashioned. Let's set new fashion trends. Research assessment must never become disconnected from a specific purpose, and given that there are many such specific purposes, there's no meaningful universal ranking, be it at global, national, or even institutional level. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy looks like a parable of research assessment. We know that the answer is 42, but we have forgotten what the question was. Maybe we need to accept that the magic number that some of us were looking for simply does not exist. Do we need assessment? It is only put to good use as long as at the end it supports the goals we're aiming for, and if not, it can easily become harmful. I don't know many people who work well if somebody constantly looks over their shoulder, and performance can substantially decrease under more pressure. So what kind of assessment actually improves quality? Self-reflection and advice can be very useful, and is support that goes further than just selection. To what extent can we build a contract on the basis of mutual trust, rather than starting with the assumption that nobody can be trusted? How does an assessment itself connect to the conclusions drawn and the actions taken as consequence? Consider an investment portfolio. You know afterwards which shares delivered profit and which did not. What does it mean for future investment? Only the safe ones? Were those that delivered the most profit the ones you would have regarded as safe the last time around? While it's important to distinguish processes, outputs, and outcomes, we need to be very careful about comparisons in assessment, because such must not drive uniformity. Daring to be different is a strategy for success. In particular, the opportunity for developing countries is to materialize on their specific strengths and strategic advantages, meeting their needs and respecting local culture, rather than trying to copy models that work somewhere else, which is usually exactly because those match the very specific circumstances of that place. The local needs are what matters, not some numbers that appear to demonstrate progress, but are in reality not more than just numbers. Trying to catch up is a recipe for always remaining behind. Instead, it's worth thinking about how to leap ahead, and it's worth noting that efficiency is a global market niche. The most valuable resource are the people, and at the same time, they should be the beneficiary of the contract with society, where equitable sharing of benefits is a major challenge for an open science global ecosystem. And that's me.
That was you. Thank you very much, Martin, for your input as well. My impression is that we've heard sort of numerous issues that I would like to focus on again in the discussion, and that have been brought up in the questions that we received in the registration process already. But before we go to that discussion, thank you for the panelists for your contributions, and we now move on in the program and give the floor to the audience as such. Giving the floor is a bit difficult in the context of a WebEx webinar. Please share your questions, send them in. We have received a few during the panel through the chat function. Please continue sending them in. We take them in as we can. If possible from your side, please indicate who you are, maybe also your affiliation. That is sometimes helpful. To sort of start the discussion and hopefully go a bit more in depth with the issues that have been brought up by Ellen and then commented on in contradiction or in agreement from the panelists, I would like to try and put in a nutshell my understanding from the spread or the width of issues that we're confronting or that we're looking at. On the one hand, I got the impression that there is sort of a distinction or a dichotomy between what one question raised, which was raised in one question, indicated that in the registration, that it's about finding a new balance between science for the sake of science, or in another word, put in another word, bottom-up science, blue sky research, as Ellen called it, and on the other hand, science of relevance to society. And maybe a keyword or keywords related to that, accountability, trust in science. These keywords were raised by almost all of you in your interventions in the panel. And related to that, the bigger question to put in a bigger picture is the question which has often been raised: should research assessments be aligned with national or international priorities? Often mentioned in that context are the Sustainable Development Goals as a reference point. Or should it still be bottom-up research? Should it still be the scientific community which defines on its own what are important issues that they would like to look at in their work? And I would like to start with Ellen and then Kostas that he can comment on that, and marketing in that order, if you can follow that. Ellen, maybe can you say something to that again? You spoke about it in your presentation, but how do you see those different aspects, how they come into the game? Can they be reconciled, or are they in absolute contradiction? How do you see that?
Well, this is really the $100,000 question of reconciling. I don't think there are oppositional sets of issues. And I think this is also why on a large scale, just thinking about research funding, on a large scale, it's good to fund lots of different approaches and so on. But the idea of, I remember a statement many years ago by the then Secretary of Education in the UK under Tony Blair, who was asked, who said something about that, someone doing something as an example on, forget, it was kind of, let me just pick out something, medieval cooking, which is always tends to be something I pick out. And I said, and he said, his Charles Clark, and he said, that's a really interesting question, but I don't have to fund it. And this is really, I expect some of these kinds of broad issues as to what constitutes socially relevant and who decides. And to some extent, there have been examples in particular countries where there have been these wide open discussions about what are the key issues that we actually want to know about. And can we fund some of those? This doesn't and should not undermine the fact that we want to fund blue sky, bottom up, let's think of some key issues. But we also need to ensure that the outcomes of this add to and enlighten the discussions that we're having as a society, because I do go back to that issue of trust. It's all very well for scientists and researchers and the higher education community to sit in what's often called its ivory tower, and lots of it being set around where the society around it is having much more difficult issues. And the more we pursue that, we will find that the universities themselves, as we find now in many countries, are coming under dispute. And that may not be a situation in some countries. I think Michael referred to the view in Switzerland. That's great, but we see a divide that is really quite very destabilizing. We saw it not just in the Brexit and the Trump elections. Originally, this divide as to where people voted, university towns voted in particular ways, what we would call islands of remain in the UK, outside, seas of leave. And so we can't, as scientists and as people living in society, ignore that world that is around us and the questions that are coming up. And so we need to find a way in which research assessment and research itself responds to these kinds of issues. That's exactly what the SDGs was all about. It was about recognizing that the problems we have are international. They cross borders, they require collaboration, because no group, no institution, and no country is capable of resolving them on their own.
So no contradiction between the bottom-up scientific community and the broader societal. It's a matter of how do you fund the breadth of it, basically, summarizing it.
Yeah.
Kostas, from your side, from the perspective of the European Commission related to planning for Horizon Europe, the mission approach has been chosen there to bring the Sustainable Development Goals aspect into the funding provided by the European Commission. What can you add from your side to the discussion?
I would agree with Ellen, and this is a very old question, and I think we need a mixture of approaches. Definitely we need if you call it blue sky, call it open, or research where you allow for serendipity, because we know that a lot of innovations come from completely unexpected areas. Some of the greatest innovations came just accidentally. So you need to be open to that. You need to allow for the miracle to happen if you want. at the same time, you need research that's aimed at societally precise and relevant problems like climate change, somebody brought up in the chat, and also or to fight cancer or to whatever else. And at the same time, you need also research that's reactive to concrete things, to concrete issues that need to be addressed and solved. I mean, a good example, we have actually the majority of research is like this. We have now a good example with COVID-19, where we and many other funders funded immediately a lot of money gave for the development of vaccines. So you need to have a problem, you need a concrete solution to this problem. So all three types of research, and in my mind, I have these three types, but maybe there are more. I mean, we need a balance between them. The question is not one or the other. The question is, what's the balance? Do we give 50, one third, or? But this, of course, it depends on the period, on what exactly the aims of each funder are, and the things like that. So in the Commission, you will see in the Commission framework programs, you will see in the past as well currently that you have all these types being addressed. The classic one in the last years for the bottom up for the first type is ERC, but also the future emerging technologies for those of you who are familiar, and so on. So we need a balance. When I was saying earlier societal relevance, I didn't mean that we all have to work. All scientists have to work in very, very precise, concrete problems that are known to society, that exist. What I meant is that scientists have to be conscious that what they do is part of society, that they are part of society. It's not like somebody gave them some money and some equipment and instruments and they can go and play in their own corner. But what they should be aware of the impact and influence and feel a responsibility towards that of what they do for society, even if what they do is looking at galaxies, which is many of them do. So, in other words, can I put it? In what physicists did before the first, or in the first half of this century, regardless, in addition to that, it resulted mostly later to huge changes in applications because of these developments. It also changed our perception of the world entirely. It changed our philosophy, our understanding of our position in the universe. It makes a big difference to somebody living today and contributed to a lot to rational thinking, to which I'm a big believer in, versus somebody that thought that the Earth is flat or that thought a few centuries ago. So this is a very societally relevant outcome. So I don't mean when I say societal outcome something that can be monetized, for instance, or something that it's a concrete drug. This one too, of course, but it's much broader than this.
Martin?
I think we should not fall for a false dichotomy between science for science's sake and science for societal benefit. Because I think there's no such thing as science which is only for science, because if you contribute to if you're advancing the record of science, at some point it will have a societal benefit. You're contributing to a societal benefit. It's not only for science. And it's a completely different question on, who is doing the translation at some point. And not everybody who is doing science directly is also working on the translational progress towards a societal benefit. But where we have to be careful is about that the research we're doing has some substance. We have to look at the content and not only celebrate the packaging.
Michael, would you like to add something from your side as well, from your perspective as a funding agency now?
Yes, I can be happy to do that. When you're especially a national funding agency or also sort of international organization or something like that, I think sometimes you have the view changes a little bit in the sense that you see the more sort of, or you try to see the larger picture. That's sort of part of what comes with the job. And so for me, I agree that individual researchers need to have that responsibility towards society. I completely agree with Kostas. But I also at the same time see an individual professor in her lab with her group or in that sort of context as an employee of a large organization. I feel that sometimes we expect a bit too much from those individual employees. We do not expect an engineer at Apple to be aware or to be a spokesperson for the impact that the iPhone has on sleep patterns or anything like that. So that's also where what I was kind of alluding to with this. I think there is space for a lot of different roles. And what Martin was saying just now, I also agree that maybe there's a role for a researcher to just do research, and maybe that's all right. Maybe that's all they want to do, and I'm perfectly happy for them to do that. As long as then there's also a role for somebody to, make sure that that research is reasonable and sensible and maybe sustainable, and that if there is a potential societal benefit, that there's some sort of translational group in the university or in a larger body that kind of brings that to society. So I think for me it's important. We do have researchers that do fill those roles of also public spokespeople, but I think the majority don't do that, and some of them actually don't do it very well either. So I feel like to some extent it might be also good to pull that expectation a little bit back and just say the research community as a whole needs to do this, and there might be room for other positions to fill that need.
Thanks. I'd like to take one question we received from Maruxa Martinez from the Barcelona Biomedical Research Park. She's in charge of scientific affairs there. And she says that I think we all agree that research outputs need to be evaluated somehow, and that the traditional research assessments are not really ideal in that sense. It emphasizes excellence and elitism rather than relevance to society, and it decreases diversity in science. And she asks, what should we measure, if not numbers of papers, index, impact factor, H-index? What other parameters can we look at, and how can we measure societal benefit, for example? And specific examples that have worked would be super useful. And I'd like to address that question to sort of the funders, and to starting again with Kostas from the European perspective, maybe. What can you say to that? And Michael, afterwards, from your perspective, from DORA, because you're collecting good examples of alternative assessment systems. Kostas, can I give you the word?
By the way, oops. Yeah, I'm muted. By the way, I fully agree with what Michael said. It's not, of course, it is not the entire responsibility on the shoulders of every individual researcher. It is to the research institutions, who are the employers of the researchers, and it is the research community as a whole. As a funder, we are not dealing so much with rating research institutions, so I'm not the best person to reply to this question. But the things that we would like to be looking at as a funder, we want to go beyond the publications and beyond the patents or similar. So we want to see the publications, not the JFI, the general impact factor, or where the paper is published, which is what people have been doing in the past typically, but actually what the paper is about and what the significance of the paper. And that's why we have been asking for a very small amount of papers, let's say 5 papers, and not listing 50 papers, but choose your 5 best papers and say why you think they are your best papers. We also want to see to what extent people have been participating in sharing, in a sharing attitude. In other words, to what extent have they been publishing open access is one very simple thing, but also to what extent have they been sharing other outputs they have been producing? To what extent have they sharing the code that they did, if it is a software code, their models, their data sets? In the future, already we can measure this if you talk about quantitative measures, and in the future we'll be able to do this much better. We are developing, I mean, technically we have it already, but we are deploying the technical infrastructure that will be needed for that. We want also to know and to encourage people, because if we're looking for these indicators, then you encourage people, you provide them motivations. To what extent have been they communicating with their citizens? how much have they been involving people in their project, to the extent, again, not, of course, we don't want that all projects try to involve citizens. No, this doesn't make sense. But there are projects in which it does make sense to involve citizens up front, either to design the project or to do some of the actual research. So how much, we don't want this to be anymore an afterthought. We want to be something that is instinctive, and from the beginning, people asking themselves, what relation does my project have to society in general, or to my own local community here where I live, or to my colleagues at the university? And does it make sense that I involve them at any stage of it, either in the preparation or in the execution, or afterwards in communicating the results? So in all these behaviors, we would like to encourage, and we will encourage them by mainstreaming them throughout the proposal preparation, the evaluation, and the project execution. Again, without having any kind of dogmas that, for instance, every single project has to have its data open. No, it's not the case. Or every single research project has to involve citizens. No, it's not at all the case. But we need to up the consciousness about these issues and to promote the upfront thinking about them.
Michael, I've seen your hand. Martin, I'm sorry, I need to skip you. I'd like to give you another question that we have received as well later on. But Michael, if you can add briefly, maybe something from your perspective, from the perspective of DORA.
Yes, I'll say two things. First one, very briefly, on the DORA website, SF DORA, we have a blog where we try to keep up with initiatives in regards to evaluation. There are a few out there. There are some very exciting ones, but they are sort of few and far between, or at least it's kind of quite hard to find them. So you can go to the DORA blog and you get a good overview of some, and vice versa. If you have an initiative at your organization that might not be on that blog, the DORA are very keen to hear from you, because DORA is understanding itself more nowadays as also sort of a platform to show best use cases of the DORA principle being applied. So it's definitely a platform where that conversation can take place. A very practical example, which is also on the DORA platform discussed, is from our own funding organization, where, for example, we have a prize called the Marcel Benoit Prize, which is the highest Swiss academic award. And there we have a few very sort of applied technical things that we have in place. So, for example, the application is completely anonymized. There's no names in there, and there's no gendered language. It's just there. You don't know if it's a man or a woman in all of the texts. And then we also, for example, split out achievements, which are in regards to the actual work that an academic has made and the impact which that work has made. And there are two different texts where it's very clear whether you're talking about the achievement of a researcher or the actual impact which that researcher's achievement has made. And throughout all of this text, for example, if you reference a paper, it is just the title and the abstract that you see in the reference list. You don't see when it was, you don't see where it was published, in which journal, or which year, or with which co-authors, or anything like that. You just see title and abstract to get an overview of what it is. Those are just a few sort of practical examples, and there's many others out there also with regards to CVs that they're moving more into a narrative space. And if I may just add one last thing, I think it's extremely important to differentiate in these things between a prize, which is an award or an evaluation post hoc, so you look back at what a researcher or an academic has done, and a grant application where you look forward. And in every evaluation you do, I think it's always important to decide in advance how much weight you put to these two types of evaluation. That's just sort of my comment on that.
Thanks. Trying to take in as many questions as possible. I have one from Giovanna Lima from Trinity College in Dublin, and she asks, I'd love to hear the panelists' vision about the incentives and structures to teach, support, and recognize public engagement inside universities. Are the structures and incentives in universities matching the drive for a civic engaged in your university? If not, what needs to be changed? And I'd like to address that question to Martin first, and then Ellen, maybe she can say something as well. from the Irish perspective or European university perspective? Martin?
Okay, structures and incentives.
At universities.
Okay. I think we have to think very carefully about how much we drive people through incentives and how much we actually empower people to take responsibility and move forward. No, we have an incentive system that, in my opinion, creates more obstacles than it is doing any good. Something that I completely liked about public engagement over the last 10 years or so was that people had the freedom to do what they want because there was no evaluation pressure. That led to some very good things to happen, and I'm concerned that we destroy initiative by, again, creating an evaluation scheme and put pressure on people. So can we think differently about encouraging people and working with people rather than by incentive systems that are devised from the top? That's my question.
Ellen, your view would be appreciated.
I expect I have a slightly different view. I sympathize with my colleague from Trinity. I think the universities and academic culture, as was written years ago about academic tribes, is one of the most problematic areas. And in fairness to institutions, if I could put it like that, they deal with lots of different drivers. And some of them are indeed the ranking drivers, but they're not the only ones. They are about international prestige and reputation and how those are measured. And many of those measures, whether it's either about research or it's about the outcomes of students, are fundamentally driven by concepts of elites. And academic culture is in itself, it's often what I call a gatekeeper as opposed to a gateway. And I think there is lots that can be done. Some universities are doing it and are prestigious, if I could use that word, in a slightly contradictory way. In terms of what's the criteria that you use for recruitment? What are the criteria you use for promotion? For a long time, the criteria that were used were fundamentally structured against women moving forward. Because of the way in which they evaluated research. And likewise, the same kind of notions are inbuilt here with regard to issues of social engagement or societal involvement or impact of research and so on. And the same is used about measuring research as opposed to teaching, looking at the criteria for promotion, looking at how that's done, looking at the evaluation process. Indeed, so I think academic culture and the universities have themselves inbuilt systems that are hugely restrictive, and that they do need to be changed. And they need to be changed at a broader level. The difficulty, I could again say in fairness to some, is that they'll feel they'll be left behind because it's such a competitive environment. But it is a widespread. We see the beginnings of this breaking down. As I mentioned, the Dutch example, Finland is also moving forward, and many universities have equally done so. I just add one comment to Kostas's comment, with which I agree entirely. I mean, why in some cases mightn't we assess the outcomes of research by not just academic peers, but by end users? Why wouldn't we bring some of them into the assessment, both of the initial process of looking at the projects that we might fund and those and the outcomes of them? So obviously, these things need to be handled in certain ways. But social accountability is an extension of what I call mode 3, as opposed to just looking at mode 2. And let's take it into that wider sphere.
Thanks, Ellen. Another question I have from the audience, Koen Vermeer from Brussels. He was the previous co-chair from the Global Young Academy. And I speak out this question. Kostas said that the scientists should be obliged to work towards societally relevant outcomes and claims this will increase trust. Ellen said something similar about social accountability via impacts. What is, and in hyphens, societally relevant is a political question. Simple example, is climate change research societally relevant, according to whom? Instead of what our speakers expect, maybe forcing science to be more societally relevant could increase partisan tendencies and decrease trust in the longer term. I'm not sure who would like to answer that best, maybe from a neutral political perspective, if I can put it that way, from Helen, but whoever would like to comment, please go ahead afterwards. Ellen, you start maybe.
Yeah, sure. Well, yes, I understand exactly, because we have seen over recent years funding being taken away from particular areas, particularly the way in which, let's say, the climate information on climate and geography and so on was taken down off the websites in the US government very directly after Trump took power. Power is what he took, not being elected, more than elections. So it is a tricky issue, but there is a broad, wider consensus. I expect that's where the SDGs come in fact, that there's a wider sense of what constitutes societal relevance. But I think there are ways in which we can look at that kind of issue. To me, that issue of science literacy and how we expand out knowledge beyond the few is really one of it is indeed one of society's big challenges, as well as the issues that we are talking about.
Would anybody else like from the panel to comment on that? Briefly, maybe.
Maybe I can say that, of course, it's political. Everything is political. So, I mean, we cannot. We should be also careful not to, like we are saying that science should not be discredited by considering it something elitist, which is happening a lot. It has caused mistrust to part of society towards science. Same thing about politics. It is, of course, politics are very important for me. In a democracy, it's based on politics and in the participation of people. And then things scroll down when precisely politics are seen as something that it is elitist, that it is, a small cast of people that manage to govern everybody else according to their interests. No. So everything should be political. With this notion of with this meaning of political that I just said, not with the demeaning, the reduced, let's say, meaning of political that unfortunately is very often used nowadays. On the substance of the question of Ken, I had seen it from before, so when I spoke, I tried to answer it already by saying that I didn't mean it at all what I said, that scientists should only work towards outcomes that are societally relevant in the sense that you can see their utility at that moment, and that it's very clear that if you solve this problem, then there will be a great benefit to society. And I brought the example of bottom-up research or serendipity research that certainly should be allowed as well. The only question is how much. So it should be the majority or the minority or whatever. But certainly, I didn't mean to. I did mean the social responsibility of researchers that should be acutely aware, especially those paid by public money, which is, I mean, mostly what we're discussing here, because we're not talking so much about private researching companies, but if they're paid by the public purse, by the taxpayer, so they should be socially responsible. But this doesn't mean that they should be working only on issues whose utility is very clearly seen at the moment that when research is being carried out.
Martin, Michael, would you like to comment? Otherwise, we continue.
Maybe I'll comment. There's I think a good example for where non-academics are taken into the evaluation process is the research excellence framework in the United Kingdom, where they evaluate output in a group with representation of non-academics within that group. And it's controversial, and there's a lot of discussion that went on around it. But one thing which I found extremely interesting was that there was a notion that it actually worked very well, because these people will take the time to read the subject matter and will very reasonably understand that not everything produces a product at the end of the day. So I think we sometimes underestimate what societal participation can do, and I think they could play a much larger role in this. At the same time, of course, these people are usually science friendly and science open already at the outset, otherwise they wouldn't sign up for this kind of task, because it's quite a lot of work. So there's within society also different groups. One group you're just singing to the choir. So if you organize a science fair at your university, that's great, but you're going to have people come who are already convinced of science and they pay for that ticket initially. I think it's the other group that is harder, and there I see again that role of science communication needs a lot more focus and a lot more effort.
Martin? Would you like to say something? Otherwise, we continue.
Continue.
I'd like to take, we're getting closely towards the end of the webinar, and I'd like to take up a question that was raised by somebody during the registration process, and it concerns the issue of ownership of assessments. Sort of, black-white thinking. Previously, you had the peer review system of journal articles, you had the scientists who were evaluating project applications to funding agencies. So it was sort of all in the hands of the scientific community, broadly speaking, and put in very simple terms. Then we had the development in the journal sector with business, with monopoly publishers taking over the system, journal impact factor which followed as a consequence, H-index as well. So the private business model sort of entered into the game, and then what I call new public management systems in terms of accountability, making sure that taxpayers' money is well invested in the science and research communities, came into the game as well, and sort of changed the whole ball game and took away some that kind of monopoly in a way from the scientific community, away from them running the evaluation and research assessment systems internally, sort of thing. And the question is there any need for the scientific community to take that initiative back to their side? How do you see that? And I'd like to start with Ellen, Kostas, Michael, and then as a representative from the scientific community, Martin, at the end. You've got the last word on that particular question. If you don't want to say anything, you just continue and give the word, pass the word on.
Very much for the question. Yeah, well, I think we are moving quite a way. I think I mentioned that we are moving towards the era of public accountability. It does vary. I say the vary because it also depends on the project, on the project and the funding thing. And the reason I say that is we're now listening, and again, to bring it to the current environment, we're now looking at vaccines and who is to authenticate emergency powers with regard to the CSE in the US or the European medicals. I mean, who looks at that? Well, they are the local peers, people who know something about the subject. It's not just an open spree. So there are areas where the scientific community is essential for evaluating the quality of what's being done. But increasingly, we are looking not just at something that is reviewed by just a narrow set, for all the reasons that I think Michael talked about before. I mean, and DORA has been at the front of this, and so have others. The issue of of cutting out new and exciting ideas. I've had that myself. I'm a co-editor of a journal, and I very much suspect that the view about a particular article had to do with it fell outside the norm. So there are those kinds of ways. So we do need to broaden that. The use of indicators and metrics on its own, not a good idea. Metrics should never be used on their own. They inform a discussion, but that's all they do. Qualitative use of peers, important. Widening that out, and mentioned end users, how they may come into that evaluation process. So I don't think there's a going back into that, except there are, as I pointed out, some examples. The current one looking at the vaccine, I think is one in particular, but I could be open to views about that as well. But I do think it's a balance, and that's where we're going.
Sorry to be rude. I would skip Kostas and Michael and give the word just to Martin, because then I would like to take up a last question, and then I think we need to start getting towards the end of the meeting. Sorry, thanks. Martin?
I see the risk that the ownership of the metrics tends too far, so far that we also see at the end the ownership of the management. And you describe what the metrics are in which you have to evaluate things. And you drive institutions to things like global university rankings. As I pointed out, we really need to think very locally. We have to think in each and every case when we do any assessment or evaluation, what is the specific questions we're going to address? And the specific question is not given in the metrics that were being delivered. And we also need to think about individuals in their specific role within local teams. That is also not addressed by all these metrics that are being delivered. And we really need to think about local questions and responsibility of local management, and not outsource what we want to do locally to companies who deliver metrics.
I take up one last question, and then we need to close down. From Richard from the School of Medicine, Trinity College in Dublin. Many questions from Ireland. This is a fascinating intellectual discussion, but while the research evaluation system based on the citation and impact factors was imperfect, how do we reduce the risk of replacing the system with one that might give precedence to master communication and social influencers, rather than the researcher with weaker communication skills, but who is producing groundbreaking research based on rigorous integrity and is recognized by his or her peers as an excellent scientist? We go the other way around. Martin, you have to start, and then just briefly, maybe 1 minute for each of the other subsequent speakers. Thank you.
Thank you for the keyword rigor and integrity, because that's the most important ingredient. And I actually have to say that I like the Hong Kong principles, because they are one of the few papers that actually look at science as a process. And this is something that is completely, does not have enough recognition as compared to looking at outputs and outcomes. We have to look more strongly at the process of the pursuit of science, and the rigor of scientific research and the integrity of the process is absolutely central.
Michael, whoever would like to add something.
Okay, thank you. Just with regards, I think, to the discussion around metrics and how to apply metrics, I completely agree with Martin that the local aspect is very important. And for the audience who might not be aware of it, the Leiden Manifesto is a publication that discusses how to use metrics, and that's one of the points in the Leiden Manifesto, and it's a very good source to look up in that regard. In regards to the question whether we are replacing the system with something worse, it depends on what we're really looking for, because I think if what you want to evaluate is just purely the rigor and the quality of research, then you need experts in that field who look at it, and they will be the best qualified to give you an answer. But that is already happening, I think, within the publication or in a journal or something like that, and it happens within academia. If you want to look at academic research output that goes outside of academia and is of value to society, or if you want to make sure that the people that a professor employs are diverse and all these kind of aspects which are equally important, then I think it's also important to have people who have expertise in these other areas, like staffing, like impact, questions, etc., to have a say in the process, because you've closed that sort of circle and opened it up to a wider picture. And there, I think it is not fair to expect or claim that the individual researcher will have the equal amount of expertise in those other areas as they do have in the specific field-specific area and the legal area. I think that would be sort of, for me, the key point in that question.
Kostas, and I think we leave the last word up to Ellen.
Okay, yes, I will be brief. I agree with what was just said, but in addition to this, the current system, as said before, does not reward a number of positive behaviors, like collaboration, like propensity to share things that we know that they are essential, and it is used in such a way where it encourages the publish or perish culture, and we know that this is very detrimental to science overall. We didn't have time today to go into the reproducibility issue, but you know that there is many people from the academic community believe there is a reproducibility crisis. And this does really a disservice to science, and this is in part provoked because of the lack of motivations for opening up and sharing, and because of the enormous pressure for people to publish. That then you discover, a short time later, that actually the experiments cannot be reproduced, the results were not robust, and so on and so forth. We have very alarming data about the extent of this phenomenon, and at the core of it, at the base of it, is this publish or perish culture and the high impact factors. So we need to use the system.
Ellen?
Sorry, thank you very much. I agree with the last set of comments. It's that notion of, there were two important points. Michael's point about it depends on what it is that the particular type of project is and what you're dealing with. I mean, that's important. And also from a wider sense, it depends. Are you evaluating the system? Are you evaluating institutions? Are you evaluating a department? Are you evaluating a project? And then you go into some of these issues again that Michael raised, and then Kostas raised a very important issue about what are you trying to achieve at the end of it, and what kinds of incentives are you trying to create. One of the other problems with the current system that falls out of narrow fields of expertise is that multidisciplinarity falls out of it. And we know that most problems are multidisciplinary, or many of them are such, and they require, even within science, that was my point, even about these public health committees that are advising governments. Most of them are made up of medical scientists and epidemiologists. Great. But where are all the other people looking at behavioral issues and all these other sets of societal impacts that we have from public health measures and so on? So I think it depends. I think the evaluation process needs to evolve and needs to change. And I think it needs to change just in the way we do it, but in terms of academic culture within institutions.
Thank you very much for this very concise sort of closing. I'm happy to say that even though we've overstepped time, we have sort of kept the number of participants along the line throughout the webinar, which is always a good indicator of the quality of the event which is taking place. I would like to apologize for all those people whose questions I couldn't take into account. We had initially planned this event to take place physically in Brussels in June for a full day event, which would have been a totally different set of and possibility of a platform for discussion and dialogue in a lengthier period of time. This wasn't possible, but I would like to thank Ellen as impulse speaker, to put it that way again, and for all the panelists for their engaged discussions. Even though there was a bit of much of agreement, I would have liked to see a bit more controversy, but anyway, the idea was not to solve any issues or bring any specific answers to questions. The idea was really to take a broader perspective and a broader view on that whole issue of research assessments, which is burning under everybody's nails these days, I think, and ideally bring across take-home messages to the participants, to their home institutions, to take the reflection further in a way, and hopefully we put the seed for further discussion in your own home institution, in your own home organization. In that sense, we would have achieved the ambition of this webinar. Thank you for all the participants for hanging on, if I may say, and listening and watching us. And thank you again for all the speakers at the webinar. And last but not least, to ALLEA and my colleagues in Berlin for having organized and set this up. It worked wonderfully well, which is not always the case with such webinars. Thank you very much to all of you, and have a good rest of the day wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Roger. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.